And this morning, I had the pleasure of introducing Dr. James Parrott, who is a labor economist who does a lot of influential work at the as a director of economic and fiscal policies at the New School in New York. He pilots deeply researched studies on pay equity, the effects of higher minimum wages, the gig economy, the economic impact of COVID on New York City, and particularly on its low-income residents, and on compensation standards for Uber and Lyft drivers, quite a spread. He's an advisor on longstanding tax equities, especially property tax reform. Prior to joining the New School in 2017, he served as a director at the Economic Policy Institute for 18 years. Today, he will tell you about how New York City's practice of contracting out human services functions exploits these workers, mostly women of color. Dr. Parrott, it's our pleasure to listen to you.
Good morning. Thank you for that introduction. I'm going to share my slides here. All right. Can you see the slides?
Yes.
All right. Wonderful. Good morning again. So I'm going to talk about New York City's longstanding practice of underpaying the wages and benefits of its service contract workforce, and in particular, that workforce that provides a broad range of human services in New York City. And the context for this is both the fact that this was this workforce was recognized as as a critical part of the essential workforce during COVID. But it's also in the context of a significant policy change on the part of New York City to address pay equity for its early childhood education contract workforce that got a lot of attention when the previous mayor, Bill de Blasio, started to phase in UPK, Universal Pre-Kindergarten, for 4-year-olds in New York City in 2014. He campaigned in 2013 on a signature issue of UPK, making it universal in New York City, effectively adding a grade to the public school system. The city was able to do that partly because it relied heavily on nonprofits that were in the early childhood education field before, including serving many 4-year-olds. So slightly over half of all of the UPK slots that the city ended up funding within the first 2 years when it fully implemented UPK were in the nonprofit sector. That, of course, focused attention on the fact that there was a great pay disparity between the pay of the certified teachers in the nonprofits and teachers in the public school system, who have long been organized by the United Federation of Teachers and have had a pretty good contract covering their wages and benefits. So after a lot of organizing on the part of that workforce and advocates for early childhood education, the city did commit in 2019 to starting pay salary parity for the certified teachers in the community-based organizations run by nonprofits. That meant a 30 to 40% salary increase. So there is precedent for what I'm making the case for today for a broader part of the workforce in early childhood education in the city's human services contract area.
Dr. Parrott, can you put your PowerPoint in a slideshow so it makes it larger for everyone to see?
Thank you. Yeah, good idea. How's that?
Perfect, thanks.
Okay. So what I want to talk about today is the fact that the city does predominantly provide for human services by contracting through nonprofit organizations. We'll point out that these contracts have been chronically underfunded with the result that a predominantly well-educated women of color workforce is paid 20 to 35% less than similarly educated city government human service employees. So I have several charts that that show the data to document this pay disparity. We'll talk about the consequences, and we'll talk about what the needed policy responses are to this. This presentation is based upon a report that the Center for New York City Affairs released about 3 weeks ago called The Case for Ending Poverty Wages for New York City's Human Services Workers, that I prepared with a colleague. The link to this is below. You can readily find our website. It's www.centernyc.org, and you could navigate to locate the report. So the city supports roughly 80,000 nonprofit workers in human services in contracts that total $5.6 billion in the current fiscal year 2022. That those contracts, there are about 4,600 contracts with a range of going to many multi-service human services providers, organizations in different program areas, some very small organizations, but a lot of the contracts go to multi-service organizations that provide services in various neighborhoods in New York City. This sector has grown a lot since 1960s as public pressure has built to respond to critical and emerging needs. Now, the question comes up, why did the city contract out these services rather than provide those through direct city employees? The city, after all, has various human services agencies, an administration for children's services, a Department of Social Services that's now part of a broader Human Resources Administration, a Department of Homeless Services that has now also been brought under the Human Resources Administration, a Youth Services Department, a Department for the Aging, Department of Health and Mental Health, and so on. So the city oversees these contracts in basically 6 pretty significant sized human service agencies. Well, starting in the 1960s, the city turned to and then became to rely heavily on in ensuing years on nonprofits to provide these. Now, New York City, of course, like many large cities in the United States, has a long history of settlement houses providing a range of services. So there are already many well-established settlement houses that have largely been funded by private contributors and foundations over the years. Another factor driving the contracting out was to limit the further growth in municipal unions, which had started to organize in New York City and many other large cities in the late 1950s and 1960s. And that organization in many places occurred very quickly and caused substantial changes in city budgets. So partly it was to economize by using less unionized or non-unionized workers whose pay and benefit would be less. And partly this was done, New York City is a large city spread out over a large geographic area. It was done to decentralize the provision of services. For these reasons and others that have emerged over the years, the city has come to rely almost exclusively on nonprofits. The dollar amount of the contracts has always been less because of the lower pay for nonprofit employees. But for many years, through the 1970s and 1980s, there were regular cost of living adjustments in the contracts meant to be passed through to the workers in line with municipal labor contract wage increases. So it had been institutionalized early on that there were going to be periodic adjustments in the amounts of these contracts so that the workers could realize, steadily rising pay in line with municipal labor contracts. That practice ended effectively almost 20 years ago, and it's been sporadic at best since then. Now, these contracts are not based on a careful assessment of what the cost of providing the services actually is. Typically, these are multi-year contracts that are done in response to RFPs that the city puts out. And after they get established, they pretty much get extended or rolled over. Many of the same organizations receive contracts from one contract period to the next. But the adjustments in the contracts have always been very ad hoc and never based upon a rigorous analysis of the cost of actually providing those services. So this disconnect between the amount of the contract and what it takes to actually provide that service has grown over the years to the point where we have these vast pay disparities that we'll document in this presentation that have really become untenable. And in an era when there's a lot of focus on racially based pay disparity and inequality, it really is unacceptable for these disparities to continue. Now, we're going to look at a lot of data here, and I want to be careful about how we define the universe of the workforce that we're looking at. So I refer to it here as the core social assistance sector, and that's mainly to separate out childcare workers and home health care workers from what I call the core social assistance or human services sector that is meant to encompass this $5.6 billion universe of service contracts. So those contracts are in the area of foster care, other child welfare, family assistance efforts, youth services, senior services, mental health assistance to homeless persons, domestic violence victims, and so on. So all of these categories are in the core social assistance area. And it's important in using aggregate data to try and make rigorous pay comparisons to try and make sure that it's an apples to apples comparison. Childcare workers typically have been lower paid. I talked earlier about the certified teachers. They're clearly at the high end of the pay spectrum in early childhood education. The majority of the workers in early childhood education are not teachers. They're childcare workers, and their pay historically has been very less. The salary parity agreement that I referred to earlier refers to the teachers and support workers in childcare centers, not the home-based childcare sector, which is up to this point is largely unaffected by the city's salary parity commitment in the early childhood education area. Although in New York State at this time, our fiscal year begins April 1st. We don't yet have a new budget for this fiscal year, but it should be agreed to in coming days. There's likely to be significant expanded investment in childcare in New York City and around the state. And partly that additional funding is to raise the pay for very low paid childcare workers. Home health care, as a lot of us know, has been expanding rapidly over the years. There are over 200,000 home health and personal aides in New York City. They're the lowest paid workers across the spectrum of all workers. Average pay is around $30,000 a year at this point. So for the charts that follow, we're going to separate out home health and childcare workers and just focus on what I call the core social assistance sector. Before I start going through the data slides, let me pause for a second and see if there are any questions at this point.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Parrott. So if you have a question, please put it into the chat. But we do have one question from Electra.
Yes. Yes, thank you. If you could enumerate some of the actual job titles rather than the categories, it would be helpful to me to think about what kind of qualifications would be required, how much education the people holding these jobs has, and so forth, to kind of slot them in my own mind where they stand in the labor force.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we're talking here in some of the slides. We'll get to this. We're talking about occupations such as social workers, counselors, which can encompass a range of different types of counselors, substance abuse counselors, mental health counselors, occupational therapists, and so on. And social workers, you could have, oftentimes, mainly there's a people with a bachelor's, often a master's of social work, with a state licensing certification on top of that, where they have to take a state mandated licensing test. Community and social service assistants, sort of entry-level workers, case workers, assisting counselors and social workers and so on. And then there are community and social service managers who manage this workforce. So that's the core sort of social service oriented occupations. And then in addition to that, there can be a range of support workers and other employees of nonprofit organizations in the facilities that provide services. So there could be custodial staff and clerical staff, administrative staff in places that serve food, like senior centers. There'll be kitchen staff and so on. But our focus here is going to be mainly on the professionals who are providing social work and counseling services. So in this first chart, we look at the very rapid growth in core social assistance employment compared to the total for the private sector overall. So over the last 30 years, from 1990 basically to 2019, the workforce in New York City, the core human services workforce, basically doubled over that time, 2.5 times the 37% increase in private sector employment. This chart shows the growth by decade over this period. You can see in the 1990s, very rapid growth in the core social assistance areas. This was in the wake of the crack epidemic and AIDS, and the city began to provide a lot of services. There was a growing need for foster care services because of families and households disrupted by the crack epidemic. And the city was responding and providing more services for populations suffering from AIDS. And in the last decade, the 2010 to 2019, also another spurt in employment and city contracting in this area. This is mainly a response to the persistence and the worsening of the homeless crisis in New York City. So substantial increases in providing shelter and services and eviction prevention services and so on. You know, a lot of services related to the homelessness problem, but also an expansion in youth services, senior services, and mental health services more broadly. So, you know, there are periods when there's rapid growth in human services employment, but generally over the last 3 decades, much greater growth in the size of this workforce compared to the private sector overall. And New York City did see pretty substantial private sector employment growth in the decade running up to the onset of COVID, a 20% increase in private sector employment. That was, you know, that totaled between 900,000 and 1 million jobs in New York City, but a commensurate growth in human services employment in that decade as well. Okay, there we go. So this is a workforce that's where 75% of the entire workforce in core human services are people of color. 72% are female, and the intersection of these two means that 55% of all workers are women of color. That's almost twice the share of women of color in the broader private sector in New York City, which is 29%. The white female share is 18% in human services, the same as it is in the private sector overall. And for the shares of white men and men of color are slightly lower in human services than in the broader private economy. So, for example, men of color are 20% of the human services workforce, but 31% of the private sector workforce overall. So, a workforce that's predominantly women of color, and one that is better educated overall. So the last set of bars on this graph show that 25% of all workers in core human services have a postgraduate degree, that is a master's degree. In some cases, a law degree, but in most cases, these are masters of social work. So 1 out of every 4 workers in this sector. Another 27% have a 4-year college degree, that is the equivalent of a bachelor's degree. So these are mutually exclusive categories. So the 25% are not part of the 27%. So overall, half have a 4-year college degree or better. That's about the same as the private sector workforce overall, although, you know, the private sector workforce in New York City, we have a big concentration of very low-paying jobs and a big concentration of very high-paying jobs. So the high-paying jobs in New York City do include, you know, a lot of fairly well-educated workers. But a greater percent, 25% compared to 20% for the private sector overall, have a postgraduate degree. So a better educated sector, no less. Important to keep in mind in looking at the pay comparisons. Now, most of the data that we analyze here is from the American Community Survey, where we're able to identify by occupation and demographic characteristics and so on. But if you use the Labor Department data on average wages for particular industries, you can see that in the core human services area in 2019, the average pay was only $34,000 a year. This would make it the 5th lowest paying large employing sector in the city's economy. The lowest paid, as I've mentioned earlier, was home health care, where for 2019, the annual pay was a little under $29,000. So core social assistance workers are a little better paid than workers in restaurants and coffee shops, who make a little under $34,000, but they're much lower paid than workers in clothing stores, where the average is $48,000, in hotels, where the average now is about $70,000, or administrative support workers, who also average about $70,000. So despite the fact that it's a very well-educated workforce providing highly valued, important human services, it's extremely poorly compensated. So I'm going to go through a number of pay comparisons. And we're first going to look at pay comparisons by education overall in the human services sector compared to the private sector overall and the public sector in New York City. Then we're going to add occupation to the pay comparison. Then we're going to add occupation and education at the same time. Then we're going to look at a particular level of education, distinguishing between bachelor's and master's. And then finally, we're going to add whether workers are workers of color or white workers to the mix. So we'll go through a sequence here of pay comparisons. So starting with education overall, if you look to the right here, we see these workers in the city's economy with a postgraduate degree. These are median salary comparisons. So the median salary in core human services for this last 5 years, on average, we take this pooled American Community Survey data to get a fairly reliable reading on what pay was. Median pay was $60,000, much less than the $80,000 median pay for public sector workers overall, or the $100,000 for people with a post-bachelor's, with a postgraduate degree in the city's private sector overall. Again, I mentioned the fact that we have a lot of very highly paid industries and workers in New York City. And this relationship where human services is less than the city, than public sector and less than private sector, holds with some variation across the entire spectrum of education attainment. Although which is higher between public sector and private sector, it varies as you go up the education attainment scale. For less educated workers tend to do better in the public sector than in the private sector. Among better educated workers, private sector pays better than the public sector. But across the board, human service workers get the short end of the stick. Their pay has been, before the pandemic, their pay was relatively stagnant for about 10 years, or maybe for 20 years, although that's based on comparing 2000 with 2019. It actually went up and then it came down and then it went back up again. But over this 20-year period, about a 10% decline in the inflation adjusted value of median annual pay for full-time human service workers, compared to about a 3% decline for full-time private sector workers. But again, a great pay disparity. Part-time workers saw a slight increase in median pay over this period, but their pay levels are less than part-time workers in the private sector. overall. Pay is so low in the human services nonprofit workforce that 20% received food stamps or supplemental nutrition assistance in 2019, more than twice the share in the public sector and significantly higher than the 12% share. If you look at it in terms of near poverty status, defining that as 200% of the federal poverty line, more than a quarter of core human service workers were below the near poverty level. Again, many times greater than in the public sector and significantly higher than private sector workers overall. When you, so from the chart before where we looked at the pay levels by education, this chart uses that same data to look at the percent, look at how far below the public sector or the private sector overall human service wages fall. So you can see in the two bars on the left, for all workers, all human service workers together, their pay is 30% less than the median pay for full-time workers in the private sector, 38% less than in the public sector. And then you could see at different education levels what the shortfall is. So for those with a postgraduate degree, human service workers, 40% less than in the private sector, 25% less than in the public sector in New York City. So here we start to hone in on occupation level. We're getting closer to a true apples to apples comparison. So if you look at everybody with that counselor's or social work occupation or social services assistants, look at what the median pay for those workers is in different sectors. You see a very similar picture where they're paid a lot less, 38% less than in the private sector overall, 33% less than in the public sector. I'm sorry, these comparisons are relative to all government workers and relative to private hospitals. Private hospitals employ, in addition to many health-oriented occupations, obviously, they employ some degree of human service workers, so counselors, social workers, and social service assistants. And the private hospital sector is pretty significant. It employs about 200,000 people overall in New York City. So we look at those occupations in private hospitals and see that the pay of human service workers for counselors, 38% less in the nonprofit sector than in government, 33% less than in private hospital. A similar picture, with slightly varying numbers in other occupations. We also compared occupations for non-social assistance areas like janitors, security guards, cooks, and then all office and administrative support. And these, significant pay disparities apply for non-social assistance workers as well. And here, again, we look at counselors and social workers, and then we distinguish between those with just a bachelor's and those with a master's. And again, see a significant lag for the human services relative to government. Again, these are shortfalls that range roughly from 20% to 35%. Then in this chart, we in order to get a decent sample size, we combine counselors and social workers together, looking at median pay. We distinguish between bachelor's and master's degree recipients, and then we add a race dimension here, looking at whites versus persons of color. The percents in the right-hand column show the shortfall for human services relative to government. So you can see that for workers of color with a bachelor's degree, 20% shortfall compared to their counterparts in the government sector. Those with a master's, a 21% shortfall. And then the last row, the bottom row here, looks at pay for persons of color as percent of pay for whites within each of these sectors, within core human services and within government. And what's interesting here is that within the nonprofit sector itself, workers of color, adjusted for occupation and education, are paid nearly 10% less than their white counterparts. In the government sector, on the other hand, they're paid a little better than whites. And again, there's a sample size constraint issue here, but I have an idea that age plays a role here as well. That many of the whites in government have are even at a given education level are younger than the workers of color in those occupations working for the public sector. So I have a few more slides here, and then we'll get to the policy recommendations. If you do have questions, feel free to put those in the chat, and I'll wrap up here in about 10 minutes, and we can take questions. So how does social assistance pay stack up relative to the city's own definition of poverty? So for the past 15 years or so, the city has calculated its own supplemental poverty rate. I mean, a lot of us understand the limitations in the federal poverty threshold and the way it's calculated. It's basically a methodology that dates back to the late 1950s, and it's still measured the same way. It's just basically the poverty levels adjusted for the consumer price index changes over time, and it's been widely criticized over the years. The National Academy of Sciences undertook a pretty careful study in 1995, which recommended a methodology for a supplemental poverty measure, which would be based on what family budgets are, how they've changed since the late 1950s, and also recognize the need to reflect differences in the cost of living across the country. It's not uniform, and yet the federal poverty level, basically assumes that a family with an income at the poverty threshold has the same relative living standard in Mississippi as it does in New York City, even though the cost of living is substantially higher in New York City than in a really low income state. So anyway, the city's been calculating, it's been using a variation of the supplemental poverty method to calculate what it refers to as a measure of poverty adapted to the city's economy, the cost in the city's economy, and accounts for housing costs higher than the national average. So the city pegs this NYC Gov, as it's called, poverty threshold for 2019 at $32,262 for a 2-adult, 2-child family. So near poverty, since this is a broader, more up-to-date poverty measure, near poverty here is considered 150% of the poverty threshold. So 150% of that level would be, roughly 52,500. So that in 2019, so that means that roughly 2/3 of all full-time core human service workers in 2019 had earnings below the city's own near poverty threshold. So hence the title of our report about the case for ending poverty wages for New York City's human services workers. The city adheres to different wage standards for different sets of workers. It's long used a prevailing wage concept to set pay standards for construction workers in New York City. And prevailing wages is meant to be what the typical wage is in a sector with some degree of unionization. So the construction trades have long been fairly highly organized in New York City, with union scales providing higher wages than in a non-union setting. The city has extended this prevailing wage concept to certain service contract areas, but not human services. It hasn't done that yet, and yet you'll see that's where we're headed in terms of making a policy recommendation. So in the service contract prevailing wage standards that the city applies, this chart shows what those levels are in terms of an hourly wage rate. And prevailing wage laws also usually call for a supplemental benefit rate to cover health insurance and paid time off and so on. So you can see that in these less skilled service contract areas like temporary office services, administrative assistant, computer assistants, file clerks, and building service employees, the wage rate of $30 an hour roughly would translate into an annual pay level of $60,000. So less skilled workers who don't have a college degree, who don't need to have a college degree, are making on a par with workers in the human services sector who have a master's degree. That's how disconcerting the pay disparities are at this point. And these prevailing wage standards for service contract workers come with a supplemental benefit rate, which would be much greater than the fringe benefit rate that many human service workers receive. In thinking about the various, so what's been the implication of these pay disparities for the nonprofit human services workforce? Even before the pandemic, this poor pay had resulted in chronic turnover and retention problems, often leading to discontinuities in service delivery and quality. Those problems, not surprisingly, have only intensified in the wake of the pandemic. As part of this sort of broader phenomenon that we're seeing about the Great Resignation and a lot of workers rethinking where they work and so on. A lot of the human service workers were considered essential workers during the pandemic. A lot of them kept providing services. Some of them were able to pivot and provide that service on a virtual or remote basis, but many workers continued to provide those services in person and so on. And yet, they didn't receive any hazard pay, and in many cases, the human service organizations themselves were very poorly funded and not funded in a very timely way by the city or any other level of government to provide services. So there's a labor shortage in many parts of the economy, but it certainly exists in the human services area in New York City. And this chronic underfunding also means that their health and retirement benefits, as I was alluded to before, are not very great. Many, I did I did a survey of nonprofits a few years ago and found that fewer than 40% provided any retirement savings provision at all, and those that did, it averaged about 4%. The pension contribution made on behalf of city employees averages about 10% of what their wage is, compared to sort of a weighted average of less than 2% in the nonprofit sector. So the underfunding of city contracts has also meant that the benefits that those workers receive tremendously lag for both health and retirement, but also for paid time off and so on. Now, not surprisingly, because nonprofits have limited resources, they haven't been able to fund career development or provide training or other human resource supports to enable the career advancement for human service workers. This has hurt retention in the sector and so on. Recognizing this, some advocates from the sector did press the city to establish a human services career advancement scholarship, which was launched just this past fall, and it provides assistance for workers who need a few more college credits to complete a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. And it also provides funding for test prep courses for people who need to periodically take the social work licensing exam required by the state. So this is a good start. It should be expanded. The initial funding is soon going to run out for that, so it needs to be replenished, but it should be expanded more across the board. But it should be made part of a broader funding commitment for the city to address these substantial pay disparities. They should adopt something like a prevailing wage approach for human service contracts. And the prevailing wage, by the normal definition, would be sort of what most workers are receiving in that sector. We don't want that to be the standard, because that's the standard we're trying to lift up. So the standard for comparison should be similarly educated workers in similar occupations working for the city government. The contract workforce, in a sense, is the indirect city workforce. So they should be paid on a par with the direct city workforce. Now, obviously, this would be very costly for the state to do this overnight, but it should commit, as it did in the case of the salary parity commitment in early childhood education, to phase this in over 3 or 4 years. So they should start by establishing a living wage floor that's above the $15 minimum wage. New York State has had a $15 minimum wage in New York City. It's different in the suburbs and upstate, but $15 has been the minimum wage applicable in New York City since the end of 2018. But there's no automatic cost of living adjustment in the state's minimum wage, as opposed to that in California and Oregon and Washington and many other states that have much higher than federal minimum wage law. I mean, that should be adjusted. That's a separate story. But in the human services sector, they should establish a living wage floor that's above the minimum wage, because minimum wage, should be seen as the wage that applies to entry-level workers who are less skilled in the workforce. So workers that can be, working in fast food jobs or very low skilled jobs, much different than in the human services sector. So a living wage floor would lift up the pay of workers at the very bottom. They should also fund, and this is something that was part of how the city responded in the early childhood education sector by funding recruitment and retention payments for workers to help stabilize the contract workforce. They could provide COLAs, now not as a substitute for parity, but as a way to begin phasing in higher pay levels. It looks like there will be a COLA of 5 to 6% in the state budget for the first time in over a decade that will apply to nonprofit workers who are working under state government contract. The city could do something comparable, but the city really needs to make this broader commitment to begin phasing in prevailing wage standard. And the city really needs to do this because a lot of all elected officials in New York City would say that it's an important policy priority to address racially disparate pay practices. Well, folks, here's a big one entirely within the city's control. The city's budget and the state budget, for that matter, are in pretty good shape this year. They have resources. They should begin to start investing in moving toward pay parity for this important contract workforce who in effect are indirect city employees. So that concludes my my presentation. I'll stop sharing the slides at this point and welcome questions.
So we do have a question in the chat. So
okay,
they mentioned, do you see it?
Yes, I can see that. So Zelma Ortiz is asking, as a former New York City human services worker, and on behalf of all my friends and family still in New York City who work in human services, this is incredible and validating research. Thank you. Okay. You discussed the recommendations for improvement. Can you discuss what progress has been done outside of the pay adjustment for pre-K teachers and scholarship programs? Is there any advocacy happening to implement these recommendations that we can help with? How can we hold the city accountable to implement these recommendations? So in the early childhood education sector, there in the run up in the period between 2014 and when they made this starting pay salary commitment in 2018, the city did fund through the union of childcare workers, which previously had been District Council 1707. Around the time of the salary parity agreement, 1707 merged with District Council 37. So, but anyway, the city had made an agreement in its contract to fund an education fund, basically a scholarship fund for early childhood education teachers. And this was meant to help people get additional college education to prepare for to get certified by the state, to get the city and the state do require pre-K programs to have certified teachers. That's a state certification, like the licensed social work certification in the social work area. And that scholarship program was meant to help people prepare for certification and to provide additional education opportunities for assistant teachers to become teachers and then certified teachers as well. So that program has been operating, I think, since about 2017 or 18, and has assisted, scores of early childhood educators to get additional education. I haven't looked at that lately. Obviously, given the scale of the need, there probably needs to be more expanded assistance to help people who might have started as an entry-level childcare worker, somebody who aspires to be a UPK teacher, to get a college degree, then a master's degree, and then get certified. But that program is in place now. So the city has been better on sort of recognizing the need for career advancement supports. And, as I mentioned earlier, we just started a program last fall in New York City for the Human Services Career Advancement Scholarship. For that to really be effective, you not only need to help people get additional education so that they can become qualified for a better job, but you need to make sure that they're compensated when they increase their education attainment level, and so on. And again, without a special commitment to redoing the contracts, to recognize that, to build in and support organizations in developing, in being able to help support workers in advancing up a career ladder within human services to both retain and expand the expertise in the sector. That's not going to happen. So that should be part of a broader commitment on salary parity. Getting back to early childhood education, I keep referring to the agreement in 2019 as a starting pay salary parity, meaning that the city phased in a commitment to bring nonprofit teachers up to the starting pay level for somebody in the public school system. In the public school system, teachers get longevity pay increases for, given years of experience. They're paid for the pay they have is for a 9-month academic calendar. In the nonprofit sector, the salary is on a 12-month basis. Those programs run year round. The benefits for in the nonprofit early childhood education sector are much less than what they are under the teacher's contract in the public school system. So comprehensive salary parity, as distinct from starting pay, would recognize pay increments for longevity, for the length of the work year, the school year, and would mean parity in terms of benefit levels as well. So there's still a way to go in terms of achieving comprehensive salary parity in early childhood education. But the important principle has been recognized and committed to on the part of the city. So it needs to continue down that road.
Could I ask, it's Electra York again, could I ask another question? Could you estimate the impact on city finances of this disparity, which you described, where tens of thousands of employees are earning X% less than in pay parity they would be earning? What is the impact? And the other side of the question is, if they were paid at parity, what would be the benefit to the city in terms of taxes and the ability of these employees to afford better housing and everything else that comes with better compensation?
No, those are excellent questions. I haven't tried to do a careful costing of what it would take. My rough sense is that we're talking about several $100 million, possibly, in the, going as high as $1 to $1.5 billion to do that. So that's significant in a city budget that's $100 billion. You're talking about, $1 billion commitment. Again, don't hold me to that. That's not the result of a precise analysis. But if the total value of the contracts now is $5.7 billion, and given that in most areas, sort of the homeless area aside, where a lot of the contract value just pays for the shelter costs, but in other human services, those are very labor intensive. So, it could be 65 to 70% of the value of most foster care or domestic violence service contracts is personnel costs. So, $1 billion relative to 5.7 billion is a rough estimate of that. In terms of the benefit, obviously a big benefit to the recipients and their neighborhoods. This workforce, tends to reside in outer borough neighborhoods, a lot in Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx, outside of Manhattan, neighborhood, moderate to lower income neighborhoods. That additional pay will be beneficial to the stability and consumer spending in those neighborhoods, support small businesses. It will lessen the need for public assistance, like food stamps. Of course, food stamps is mostly federally funded. That's not going to save the city a lot if somebody's pay is increased so that they don't have to draw food stamps. But the city does pay a portion of Medicaid, and fewer human service workers would require Medicaid. But generally, investments in raising the pay are better for economic growth, better for the city budget in the near term, and obviously over the long term. There was a significant increase in pay. I'm talking about the city economy generally in the 5 to 6 years before the pandemic, as a result of the fact that the state did double the minimum wage between 2013 and 2019. And I did another separate report recently documenting the broad macroeconomic benefits to the city economy that helped fuel this record growth that the city experienced beforehand. It benefited families across the board. We saw significant increases in median family incomes for Black families, for Latinx families, for Asian families, and others. There were broad benefits from that. So we would see some version of that by raising the pay of this workforce.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat, Dr. Parrott.
Okay, this was a long one. Let me read it first and try and get the gist of it.
Let me see it.
All right, so this has a link to an article in governing in the governing publication about racial wealth disparities. And the question is, how can we push systemic change in the larger political landscape? Well, that's the question of the hour. There was clearly a compelling need for that, and the early part of this chat cites data on wealth disparities, which are much greater than income disparities, which are pretty horrendous to begin with. That was true before the pandemic. I just talked about how there was significant progress made in raising wages of people in the bottom half, the income distribution in New York before the pandemic, but it still left New York City in a place where there's widely disparate income distribution, and then wealth disparities that are a multiple of that. The pandemic has, early on in the pandemic, I did a report about a new strain of inequality. I referred to the pandemic as a new strain of inequality because, in addition to the fact that it revealed great disparities in the provision of healthcare, which then had implications for greater susceptibility on the part of communities of color and lower income communities to the virus itself, that the economic impact of the virus was heavily concentrated on workers in the face-to-face service industry, i.e. leisure and hospitality, and in the support services that support workers who are office-based, which is a big factor in New York City. So, 75 to 90% of the job displacement was in the face-to-face service industries, where workers usually are paid by the hour, and if you don't go to work, you don't get paid. There's no such thing as remote work. Like in a restaurant, there's no remote work in a restaurant. And this workforce is, much more heavily low income, much more heavily workers of color. We saw the data for that in New York City. Less educated workers, more likely to be foreign-born than native-born, and so on. It had a more concentrated impact on low-income workers than usually what we see in a business cycle downturn, where some portion of those workers losing jobs who are highly paid workers in finance and professional services, and so on. So the pandemic has tremendously exacerbated these income and wealth disparities. And we see that also, reflected in the data on the tremendous rise in the fortunes of billionaires, and many large corporations, the finance sector, and large tech companies have flourished during the pandemic, just as a consequence of the type of sector that they're in. So this has further intensified disparities. And it is a real challenge to get public attention to focus on that, with the extreme partisan polarization in Washington these days. The Democrats are limited in what they can do, and the appetite for significant federal funding intervention has largely diminished over the past couple of years. There was a significant financial intervention early on. We've seen, for example, in New York City, that once federally funded unemployment benefits ended in September of last year, I have a chart for a presentation I'm doing tomorrow that shows the increase in people on temporary public assistance in New York. It's basically taken off at a sharp upward angle since September, to the point where the number of people receiving public assistance in New York is 22% higher than what it was before COVID. And about that same, there's been about that same increase in the number of people receiving Medicaid. And food stamp rolls are up citywide about 17, 18% from where they were before the pandemic. So most of the federal assistance in response to COVID has ended. And yet, for many low-income communities of color, the pandemic recession is far from over. Other questions?
Do I get another one? I'm sorry.
Sure.
Yeah. Our mayor of New York has articulated a rather ambitious program to deal with many of the problems that we have on the streets of New York, having to do with homeless populations, people with mental health crises, and also unlawful behavior, which he plans to address more than has been addressed in the past. What for this population that you've been focusing on, what do you think the impact will be on the employment of people in these positions and the prospects for better compensation for them if they're employed by nonprofits, which they will be, I guess?
Well, so it's we will know, I think, in the next 2 to 3 months. The city's budget is on a July 1st fiscal year. The mayor released his preliminary fiscal budget for 2023 about 6 weeks ago in mid-February. The city council has held a round of hearings, all during the month of March, and recently issued its response to the mayor's budget. The council is calling for significant increases in funding in many areas, including in many social service areas. And while the city council proposed significant increases in funding, they also recognize that the tax revenues are coming in better than forecast, and the tax revenues would allow the city to afford these additional budget priorities that the city council identified. So this very lopsided COVID economic impact has meant that, while there's very high unemployment and a lot of labor market dislocations among lower income workers in face-to-face service industries and so on, it's also meant that finance sectors continued to do very well. The professional services, information, tech sectors have also done well. So tax revenues in the city are doing very well. So both this and the state is also benefiting from this, because the state budget, state revenues rely very heavily on personal income tax revenues. So this flourishing of incomes for high income people has really benefited the state budget. So the city and the state budgets currently are in very good position to increase investments. Now, you want to make sure that you don't make commitments that you won't be able to sustain in the event that the economy cools significantly from where it is at this point. And there is some risk of that. So there's a need for some caution, but I think, well, it's very challenging. I mean, the first part of your question would address the public safety issues and homelessness and so on. And the mayor is trying to deal with that. Those are complicated issues, and he often talks about the need to get to the root cause of a problem, a public safety problem, of homelessness, and so on. And it's obviously it's very appropriate to say that. But the challenge is to formulate policies that get at those root causes. So there's a way to go in doing that. On the plus side, one of the things that this mayor, Eric Adams, campaigned on was a significant increase in low-income tax credits in New York City. And part of his budget proposal, which then he also needed to advocate for in Albany, because the state action is needed to enhance the city's earned income tax credit. He proposed a significant increase in the city's earned income tax credit. Previously, it had been 5% of the federal earned income tax credit, so that whatever you received under the federal EITC, you would get 5% of that on top of that from the city. And then the state also has an EITC. The state provided 30%. So the mayor proposed to increase the city EITC from 5% to 30%. That's a huge increase. And then the state legislature is proposing to increase the state EITC, and any increase in the state EITC would also benefit New York City residents. So the proposal there is to increase it from 30% to 37.5%. So if those measures are part of the enacted state budget that we hope to see in the next few days, that will mean a significant increase in the earned income tax credit for New York City residents. Basically, if I can do this math quickly in my head, going from a combined 30 and 5%, 35% to a combined 37.5 and 30%. So it would go from 37.5 to 67% in 1 year. That's a pretty significant enhancement. Again, but it's not, as a policy analyst, I wouldn't say it's the most artful way to do that, because the EITC, while it's very valuable, it doesn't address the situation of low-income families across the board. The EITC is structured to provide benefits to parents, to working parents, basically, and it's meant to be an incentive for people with children to enter the workforce and to stay in the workforce, and they're rewarded as their income goes up to a certain level, and then the benefit tapers off. But if you don't have children, you get very little from that. Or if you're under 25, you get very little from the EITC. If you're over 65, you get very little from the EITC. So it's not as well-rounded as an approach as one might have if you just said, we're going to invest $250 million, which was the cost of the mayor's, taking the city EITC from 5 to 30%. If you said, here's $250 million, I want you to craft, low-income tax credits that will do the most to alleviate poverty. That would be a different exercise, and you wouldn't end up with that result. But anyway, so that was a very positive thing, although in the scheme of things, what the mayor said on the campaign trail actually was that he was proposing $1 billion in increased low-income tax credits. So we will need to hold him to that over time, but let's take things one step at a time. But anyway, so the city budget will be an important forum for resolving what the city is going to do in the near term. So we have a new mayor. There was a lot of turnover in the city council. We have term limits in New York City. So more than 2/3 of the city council members are new, and so on. So we will see the first budget for this new city council and the new mayor. But it comes at a somewhat propitious time for fiscal issues anyway. A very supportive state budget and a very promising revenue situation. So I think there is a constituency in the city council for addressing a pay disparity, although they didn't outline anything as comprehensive as what we've been talking about here.
Dr. Parrott, I think we have to let you go now, although I'm reluctant to do that because I've got about 5 more questions. But thank you very much for presenting really very comprehensive, challenging coverage of the topic. A lot to think about. Wish we had more time with it, but I'm glad to know that you're working on this. And I certainly would like to follow the work that you're doing. Again, thank you very much on behalf of the EOC and on behalf of the people who've been listening to this program.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much.